It's another coronavirus episode, and find out how you can get a free template for amending your contract when it is canceled due to coronavirus.
This is the Wedding Industry Law Podcast, a podcast dedicated to wedding professionals that are just trying to keep it legal. And now, your host, Rob Shank.
All right, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Rob, and we are going to have, again, as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to have another episode dedicated to navigating the waters of the coronavirus, COVID-19. But the first thing I want to do is tell you that Wed Forms LLC is offering free contract amendment templates for those who have weddings, which is pretty much everybody, those who've had weddings canceled or are certain to be canceled due to the coronavirus. Wed Forms LLC is kind of like a legal Zoom of the wedding industry. It is a website that offers downloadable templates for wedding professionals. That's WEDFORMZ.com. WED, WEDEED. Let me do that again. WED, WED Forms, FORMZ.com. Again, Wed Forms has contract templates, this type of thing that you can download and then take to local counsel or manipulate in such a way that is specific to your business and get to using them. And so Wed Forms LLC is offering free templates that will act as amendments to contracts that have been canceled or need to be postponed due to the coronavirus. So if you find yourself in a situation where the wedding is to be postponed, that you have come to that agreement with the client that, okay, that's cool, we are going to postpone this till date X. This particular template could be used after being reviewed by your local lawyer or making whatever changes you need to make that are specific to your jurisdiction. You can use this template to sign with the client, and it covers a lot of the information that you would need to cover in that situation. So essentially what happens is that, when you need to make changes to a contract that are mutual, that you and the client have come to an understanding that you need to make a change to the contract and you're both in agreement to it, then you can do that. You can amend the contract. A lot of times that's the language that we use is you've amended the contract. So in this instance, this is a template that allows the client and the wedding professional to amend the contract to reschedule an otherwise postponed wedding. This is a template to perform an amendment to a contract. So there's two things that are required in order to use the template from a logistical standpoint. Number one is that you would have already needed to have a contract. And number two, you and the client have agreed to postpone the canceled event due to the coronavirus to another date in the future. So those are kind of the two prerequisites to being able to use it. So again, it's something that's used if your event has been canceled due to the coronavirus, but you're wanting to reschedule it. How do you get it? This is a good question. So I am not technically savvy enough to make this thing something that's downloadable. But you can email rob@wedforms.com. Again, to get the template, you can email rob@wedforms.com and you'll get the template and a guide to use the template. There's for many reasons, Wed Forms LLC is its own thing. It's its own company. I, in fact, own that company. But Wed Forms is not a law firm. Even though I wrote the thing, the main thing that I want you to understand before you email me for this template is that no human person, not even AI at this point, can draft a template for you that works for everybody in the country. That is an impossibility. This contract, although I'm an attorney and I have experience in this area, I have drafted this thing. I have drafted it only from a general standpoint, only from the idea that this is something that can be refined by the particular client in the jurisdiction that the client is in. So you will need to make changes to this contract depending on where you're at. So that's rule number one, is understanding that this thing is not necessarily download it and go use it. It is a starting point for you. So that is disclaimer number one. Disclaimer number one is that Wed Forms LLC, where you're getting this contract from, is not a law firm. They are not your lawyer, and you're going to have to make changes to this template. And that's why it's called a template. Second disclaimer, second rule of Fight Club is don't email me questions about it. I cannot answer them. If you've got questions about how to implement this template, you will need to ask your specific attorney. I would love to be all of your attorneys listening to this, but I am not. I am 100% not your attorney just because you are listening to this podcast or because you have emailed Wed Forms to get the guide or the template. I know I sound like a meanie, but I just want to make sure that I don't get sued and I don't get my license taken away because I'm trying to give something away. So that's why I have to give all these disclaimers. And in fact, as a spoiler alert, the episode next week is going to be all about why I have to say these ridiculous things, why attorneys are governed by these, I would argue, archaic rules. But we'll talk about that next week. But at any rate, template to amend your contract if it has been canceled or needs to be postponed because of the coronavirus. You get it by emailing rob@wedforms.com, and it'll get sent to you with the guide on how to use it, so long as you understand that you will need to make changes to it once you get it. All right? Are we all on the same sheet of music at this point? I hope so. Okay. So let's move on to the next thing. I have been asked this question a few times. I can't remember. I would give attribution if I could remember who asked me this question. But the question I've been asked a couple times is, what happens if my contract does not have a force majeure provision? What happens if I don't have an act of God provision in my contract? And obviously, the coronavirus, COVID-19, has caused the event to not be able to go forward as originally scheduled. So for those that are new to this podcast, if you want to learn more about force majeure provisions and everything I think about them, you can go to the first or second episode. I think that we covered that at length. Also, I was recently on the Wedding MBA podcast. I think that if you listen to that, you'll get a pretty good idea between my podcast and that podcast. A lot of the questions about force majeure and coronavirus and how that works, I believe that I answered them pretty good, if I do say so myself. So you can go there if you want to know what force majeure means and how coronavirus and force majeure intersect under the law. But the question here is, what happens if I don't have that? So in reality, the force majeure clause is a shield that prevents the client from suing you or you suing the client for breach of contract for not showing up or not paying you for an event that has been made or rendered impossible due to an unforeseen force. Strikes with labor, civil unrest, tornadoes, floods, fires, pandemics. And that's what the force majeure term, the principal reason why we have it in there. The second thing is about the force majeure is that typically the typical force majeure clause, and they're all written differently, even though it's a lot of boilerplate stuff, is that you have a certain amount of time, but the two parties have a certain amount of time to first, the parties need to do the best they can to move forward with completing the contract as soon as the force majeure event has subsided. And typically contracts will have a certain amount of time in which to do that from a wedding industry standpoint. So a lot of times the contracts will say something like, we'll try to rebook within a year, something like that. So number one, you can't sue each other for breach of contract most of the time. Number two is you got to work forward to continuing on and executing that contract to the best of your ability once the force majeure event has expired, to the best that you can. So what happens when those obligations are not set forth in the contract because you do not have a force majeure clause? Well, if we take this to the logical conclusion, then what happens is that the client or the professional can sue one another for breach of contract, for not showing up or not paying me because I showed up in the middle of a pandemic. So what happens then is that, and again, this actually is this will be a podcast for the future about what a breach of contract lawsuit actually means and what you need to prove and this type of thing. But you would, one of the things is if you don't have a force majeure event or force majeure clause, file the lawsuit, and we'll say that it's the client suing the professional for not showing up in the middle of a pandemic. Then essentially the client's going to say, here's how I was damaged. I was expecting my planner or my DJ to show up. They didn't. And then what the professional would do as the defendant in that lawsuit is typically you can file along with your answers, what they call that, which is I deny it all. This is bullcrap. Is there are certain things called defenses, contract defenses. So for example, I didn't sign that contract as a contract defense in some instances, or that's not me, or let's see, it was forged. That's not my signature. These are some options. I'm not saying that's going to be your option, but the option in this instance is going to be there are defenses. And again, this will depend on what state you're in, but for the most part, it's called defensive impracticability or defensive impossibility. And those function to say, Judge, again, something has made it impractical or impossible for me to go forward with this, i.e. the governor of the state has made a proclamation saying that nobody could get together over 10 people, and therefore I could not risk arrest if I showed up to this event. And I am not a soothsayer. I am not omnipotent. I am not, the higher force in this situation. But I would say that you're probably on pretty strong footing if, in fact, your wedding that you're being sued about happened in the middle of the height of a pandemic where everything is shut down and there are laws in edicts and executive orders and governor's orders forbidding people from getting together. That is impossible. You couldn't do it. You would be risking arrest, among other things, risking disease and infectious disease. So I think that you would get a sympathetic judge if, in fact, that happened. But I guess what I'm trying to say is you would actually not a lot of times, but there's the possibility that you would actually have to make it all the way to the fact that you're getting sued before you can bring up the defense of impossibility or impracticability. That's how that would work. And at the end of the day, the individual plaintiff in that suit would probably lose because in the height of a pandemic, you have a strong argument, especially if there have been proclamations saying that you can't get together, that you will prevail in your defense in a case against you for breach of contract. So that's probably what would happen from carrying that idea to its legal conclusion. But what if they don't sue you? Well, I'm going to say again, even if you don't have a force majeure clause in your contract, that it is in everyone's best interest to attempt to the best they can to reschedule the date, to rebook that date, because it's just it's a bummer to be sued. It's a bummer to have to sue. And the only person or persons that are going to be ultimately responsible for telling you and the client whether or not somebody owes you money, he or she owes you money, you owe them money, is going to be a judge or jury. It's not an attorney on a podcast. It's not an attorney on TV. It's not your best friend. It's not something that you read. Then they're saying, well, I've read your contract, read this, and this is exactly what's going to happen. You know, you don't have to worry about being sued. No, anybody can sue anybody for anything, for any reason. Then you get into degrees of success. As I mentioned before, you get into degrees of success of lawsuits. But I'm saying, even if you've got to take it a little bit, take it on the chin a little bit, it's better to reschedule and work that out as best you possibly can. So that's kind of my 2 cents on if you do not have a force majeure clause in your contract and the wedding was canceled or needs to be postponed, or I should say, I want to use my words right. I should say cannot go forward at the current time or as scheduled. So the next thing I want to get into is I received a question from a listener, fantastic person, and the questions also deal with the coronavirus, and her questions are simply, what happens if a wedding business does not have enough cash flow to provide refunds? Is the expectation that they need to close, or they need to go bankrupt? Is the only safe thing that you can do is to rebook the date? You know, essentially, I'm looking at, several events that can't go forward. I can't refund everybody at once, or I have no money, this type of thing. What are the things that we can do? Number one is I'm likely not the person that can answer this the best. I mean, like Dave Ramsey would probably be the best person to answer this, but what I can say from a legal standpoint, as an attorney, is that typically the law works and again, this will depend on your jurisdiction in your contract, but typically everything is within reason. So if you have a force majeure clause and you're working with rebooking the date and you can't rebook that date, typically everybody goes back to status quo ante, but it'll depend. But even if everybody has to go to status quo ante, meaning that everybody has to be in a position where they were before they signed the contract, it's not as though a refund that would need to be made in that situation, if that's the case, has to be done right away. It has to be done 100%. It has to be done within 5 minutes. It has to be through wire transfer, or only in nickels and dimes, or, you pay me in back rubs. All of everything that happens like this, that's not literally spelled out in the contract, there's an air of what is reasonable in a particular situation. And I think that typically, and again, following this to the logical conclusion of if it's a judge or a jury listening to this, that any wedding professional that could potentially be on the precipice of bankruptcy or the precipice of not being able to pay bills and continue going forward as a going concern, that it is within reason to stagger refunds. It is within reason to make out deals and value propositions such that you don't have to give refunds. So for example, like, okay, how about if I owed you $1,000, what if I gave you $500, but if I'm a photographer, I would take baby pictures or headshots, something that would allow you to retain the cash flow that your business needs, value propositions in that way. But again, value propositions aside, if a refund needs to go back, maybe it's like, hey, listen, I give you 30% in 30 days, 30% in 45 days, 30% in 90 days, something along these lines, where in essentially what the business professional, the wedding professional will be doing is saying, okay, that's what I consider reasonable. I think that that's what I can do. That's the best that I can do, considering that we're in a situation where I'm doing this with maybe 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 different clients. if that's not fast enough for you, you're pushing your chips all in and going, well, then you sue me, and then you go tell the judge that, well, Your Honor, I wasn't going to get my full refund for 90 days. And I don't know, depending on where you're at, maybe the judge is going to go, that's well within reason. You're insane because we're in the middle of a pandemic and this industry is on its head. Right? You see what I'm saying? Like, I mean, what is reasonable will depend on where you're at in the jurisdiction and how long it's going to take you to do the refund. But, those are the concepts that will help you in the eyes of the law, doing what you can within a certain amount of reason, I guess. Now, who's to say what's blah, 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 but is having to come up with, if you've got 10 clients and that's $1,000 per client, and you haven't been able to rebook those dates, and so therefore you're having to do refunds and whatnot, and that's $10,000. What's reasonable in that situation? You have to, maybe it's approaching everybody evenly. Everybody gets 15% within 10 days, and then whatever, come up with something. And I'm saying in today's climate, if you're working from a good faith effort in those regards, then it's likely, I can't guarantee anything sitting here in my podcast booth, my desk. I can't guarantee you, but I think that it will, the law tends to favor that, and judges and juries are sympathetic to that. Because a lot of times that'll come into evidence, like, Your Honor, these are all the things that I did to make sure that this one particular client got his or her money back. But at the end of the day, you're never going to be able to stop somebody from suing you if they want to sue you. That's just how our system works. But hopefully they have a bald-ass attorney like me on their side going, don't be a moron. That would be dumb to sue them for this reason. I had somebody call me, and this is not how it's been, like, in terms of like the number of calls that I've been getting. Like 9 out of 10 times it's like, we're all cool in the gang. I mean, this is extremely stressful and it sucks, but like, I haven't been fighting with anybody. This is the one person. This wasn't a professional. It was a client. And it ended up, they were wanting to sue for like the difference of, they were going to get a refund of like 80%, but they wanted 80%, but they're only going to get 50%. And so I'm like, okay, well, you wanted to sue them for 30% of that refund. And I was like, well, how much money was that? And it was like $100. It's like, man, don't come to me with that. You're not going to, I mean, like, is it possible that you could prevail on that? Maybe. I doubt it. But even if you could prevail on that, is it worth that money? I mean, it's pretty crazy out there. For some people, but that is a majority of the time that's not happening. What else about the coronavirus? I think that well, actually, let me do this again. I will put a link to the show notes, but I think I've been on 150,000 different shows at this point, talking about the coronavirus. And if you really want hours of contract talk and coronavirus talk and contract coronavirus talk, I'll put links in the show notes of the podcast that I've been on. This podcast, in terms of the Wedding Industry Law podcast, which episodes deal with the coronavirus, that'll be in the show notes. So if you can listen to them, as much as you want and get informed. Again, if you want a copy of a document that will be used in case you need to amend your contract because your wedding couldn't go forward as scheduled, then email rob@wedforms.com, rob@wedforms, that's WEDFORMZ.com, and you'll get an email back with the template and the guide on how to use it. And it's free of charge. I promise you that I'm not using your email for anything. I hate emails, so you won't be on an email list or anything like that. So don't worry about it. I'm not fishing for information. I just want to get this thing out there. And I think that's about it. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. Hit the like button if you're watching on YouTube. If you're so inclined, please leave a review. Those help the podcast come up in when people search for things, I think. And it also makes me feel good. So who's against that? So with that being said, if you have any questions, general questions that you'd like answered in the podcast or addressed, send them to me. And with that, we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Wedding Industry Law Podcast. This podcast is intended for general information only. Nothing in this podcast is intended to be legal advice. Do not rely on this podcast for your legal matter. Instead, consult an attorney in your area. Thanks, obrigada, até semana que vem.